Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the ISCEA Sustainability Series. Today's guest is Nancy Gillis. It's an absolute pleasure to have her here today. She is a sustainability and circularity expert, and she is the current Chief Executive Officer at the Global Electronics Council. Her expertise comes from various areas, including nonprofits, business management, and government positions. She has been a previous director at the General Services Administration and a global lead at EY. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nancy today. Again, it is a pleasure, and we're really excited to ask you some questions about sustainability, technology, and circularity. So welcome, Nancy, and if you'd like to share a little bit more about your current role at the Global Electronics Council and give the audience a little bit about what the Global Electronics Council is.
Great, thank you. And I really appreciate this opportunity to converse today. As was stated, I'm the CEO of the Global Electronics Council. Many of us may know us as the Green Electronics Council since we just rebranded a little over 2 months ago. And we were the Green Electronics Council for more than 15 years. And the transition away from the Green Electronics Council to the Global Electronics Council, I think, is pertinent to our conversation today, because it signifies our recognition as a nonprofit organization that sustainability has truly now transitioned from purely focusing on environmental issues to that triple bottom line of environmental, social, and economic. So the Global Electronics Council, quickly, what are we? As I mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization. We are a globally focused one. Our mission is to see a more sustainable and just world. The way that we seek to achieve that vision is to focus on the power of the purchaser. So we are an organization that helps support large-scale purchasers, public and private sector, and we don't do support across all of the sectors where large-scale purchasers are active. We focus on technology. Why? Because technology really is pervasive. And as sadly we're coming out of the COVID dilemma that has really changed the way that we interact, we have seen, though, the importance of technology in those interactions. So our nonprofit, the Global Electronics Council, we focus on leveraging technology for greater sustainability and justice, and we really support the purchasing power of large-scale purchasers in that space.
Great, thank you so much for that. That kind of touches upon the first question I wanted to ask you is, how are you currently transforming supply chain to be more sustainable? And I think it's very clear that your role with the Global Electronics Council definitely is your current way of transforming supply chain. But if there's anything else that you want to add to that and touch upon what you currently are doing, maybe more specifically in your role to transform supply chain.
Sure, that's a good question. So I say, as a nonprofit, we support these large-scale purchasers, but with what? That's a good point. What we do is, you've got these purchasers, and by large scale, I mean purchasers who buy thousands of IT products. So we support purchasers who are buying laptops and tablets and mobile phones, servers, televisions, monitors, you name it. Normally the things that you see within an office environment, be it in an office in your home like mine or in an office in a building. And what really the big question has been increasingly over the last 15 years is, hey, I want to put my money towards something that is credibly sustainable. I want to do that as I buy technology, but what does credibly sustainable mean? And so what we do is we help identify purchasers what are credibly sustainable and increasingly circular IT products and services. And one of the major ways that we do that is we do manage an eco-label called EPEAT, and that is the most used eco-label for technology products globally. So it's had tremendous adoption. And an eco-label, what it does is it sets criteria. It's a way that you can, when you're looking at something, say, is it really more than something else? In this case, is this technology product more sustainable than non? And EPEAT is a life cycle eco-label. That means it covers the sustainability criteria across all of the phases of the product. So we help purchasers when they're trying to buy technology through a number of ways, but one of the well-known ways is through our EPEAT eco-label, and they buy products under that eco-label, and they know that they're addressing the environmental and the social impacts that those technology products are having throughout that life cycle: extractive, manufacturing, assembly, use phase, and of course, end of life. And it's end of life where circularity starts becoming key.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think that at ISCEA, we also talk about the importance of circularity and closing that loop. And in addition to your eco-label, what other current technologies do you think are the most transformative in procurement or supply chain purchasing right now that you have in mind?
A really good question. So since we work with a lot of large-scale purchasers, both in the public sector, so at country level, city, municipalities, and also in the private sector. So most every Fortune 500 firm now is committed to sustainable procurement, both indirect, so for the stuff that they use within their offices, but also direct. So these are materials that they're actually using to make their products and put those products on the market. And when you start looking at, well, what are those purchasers really demanding, particularly as we move towards circularity, it's really transparency. And I know we've been talking a lot about transparency in the supply chain for a long time, but what's really cool right now is we're starting to see technology actually, such as DNA markers, distributed ledger technology, actually allow us to know where the materials that are going into these products are originating and have us basically follow that product through its entire manufacturing assembly process. It's not there yet, but it's those types of technology, those that actually allow you to understand full transparency on the supply chain from extractive phase, so what is actually going into it, all the way through not just use, but increasingly when products come back to a manufacturer, where those are going as well. It's transparency. I think any of the technologies right now, supply chain supporting that, are really the ones of greatest interest.
Definitely. I think we agree with you on that there. And then just to talk a little bit more about that in the supply chain itself, there's so many different steps along the way, that you have to include transparency in, and there's different ways so that you can implement sustainable technologies at each step down the line. However, this is something that I really ask a lot of people that I get to interview, and something that always people have a different answer for, and it's, what is the difference between a sustainable supply chain and a circular supply chain? Because today at ISCEA, it's something that in our sustainability supply chain program, we talk about. We end the course with a chapter on circular economy because we think that you really need to close that loop. And so I would like to know from you what the difference is there, maybe just for our viewers that might not be familiar with, the difference between just being sustainable and being circular.
It's a really good question. And in fact, there's a ton of people who don't know because the two kind of not only overlap, but I would say that from our organizational perspective, one is an extension of the other. So when you talk about sustainability, we were still talking about a linear system, right? Kind of this, we make it, we buy it, we use it, we dispose of it. And sustainability brought a efficiency perspective to that. So what you were trying to do is you were trying to make it using less water, less natural resources. You were trying to use it as effectively and efficiently as possible. And of course, in technology, that's energy efficiency, which is important because, of course, energy efficiency, greenhouse gases, and climate change are pretty much causal. And then when you were done with it, you were trying to keep it as long as possible. So you were focused on repairing and you wanted to refurbish. So you wanted to keep it in play for as long as possible. But in sustainability, there was always a recognition it would have an end of life. And then you would try to recycle, but you couldn't absolutely recycle. And so some of this is going to go to waste. Circularity tries to break that paradigm. It tries to make sure the linear process, wait for it, becomes circular. So what's the difference there? Well, it really means that you're still having all of those efficiency gains and focus that you had under sustainability. You're not letting go of that at all. The core difference is, though, that at the end of the day, when you finally get to an end of life and you're like, you know what, this thing just no longer does what it used to do, and you have refurbished it, you have repaired it, right? You've gone through first use, second use, you've tried all these innovative ways. Instead of them breaking it down and it in portion going to some type of landfill, What hopefully you've done is you've designed it as such to where that thing can be broken down and those material flows go back into a production stream. It might not be yours, right? You may not be the company who needs the stuff that's coming back. It could be somebody else's, and somebody, in a sector that's not even your sector, which is why we call it a circular economy, right? It means that material flows are going back somewhere in that economy, not necessarily where they originated. That's the whole point, is the idea that there really is no more linear model. There is no more waste. And this is a major change, and particularly is going to rely on supply chain practitioners and sourcing practitioners and designers to be successful. Does that help explain?
Yes, for sure. I think that's a very important point, talking about design and thinking that in the beginning, you have to design your supply chain in a way that you're thinking it in the end to be circular. You can't get to the last step and say, okay, now we have all this waste. What do we do with it? Because then you're at a place where you might not have the ability to loop it back. You need to think about that in your first step. And I think it's important and really interesting nowadays that supply chains are also looking at smaller loops within the supply chain, because you're really only as strong as people say, your weakest link. So every step in the supply chain, you might be able to loop something back. You might not have to wait until the end product, which is something really interesting. And
Absolutely.
For sure. And moving forward, I think, what do you think are the most important sustainable practices to reduce enterprise risk, which is something you're an expert on, and maximizing innovation?
Yeah, I think that, what really is a focus right now, and again, COVID has brought this to the forefront, is the resiliency of supply chains. And so the way to really increase risk is to start looking at that resiliency from a supplier diversification perspective. We had always kind of looked at it from a supply chain. You never wanted to have suppliers either gathered in the same geographic region, right? The tsunami has taught the automotive sector that having all of your suppliers for particular components in one geographic area, and that then being struck by a natural disaster, really was horrible. And so we had learned that you need a geographic supplier diversification, but here you're really getting a secondary dose of that warning and understanding. So it's really the diversification. It's also the fact that a lot of that innovation now happens working with your suppliers. So there's also been a strong emphasis on, to your point, how can you engage with your suppliers in your supply chain to start some of those feedback loops, right? To start being able to take back some of the materials and such. I think that there's a lot of innovation that is happening. So there's a strong emphasis not only on diversification, but collaboration as well. There's no way that we can make a transition from a linear system with our supply chain absent of our engagement with our suppliers. It just has to be a natural partnership. So we think really that's where a lot of the new innovations and work needs to happen, is possible, and is really going to move us forward. Sounds simple, but for those of us who've been supply chain and supplier management for a long time, it's not as easy as it sounds.
Definitely not as easy as it sounds. It's a current work in progress. And you touched upon it a little, and speaking about different roles in the supply chain, it really does take the effort of a lot of different, it's designers, it's suppliers, everyone along the way has a role in this transformative process. But one person in particular is the supply chain manager. And a question I have for you is, they kind of oversee the entire supply chain. So how can mid to upper supply chain managers implement circular thinking and technologies in their organizations? Maybe it's an organization that has already made a few steps, or it's an organization that, hasn't really thought about circular thinking. So maybe give a little bit of your expertise on a more elementary implementation and then something more advanced.
So that's a really good question. So from a supply chain perspective, what we advocate at the Global Electronics Council is collaboration. You heard me say it. You can't do this transition in an organization on your own. You need to engage with your suppliers. You also need to engage with the other programmatic or function areas within the organization. So first and foremost, I think when you start talking about circularity, what's happening is those designers are thinking about first and foremost, what are some of the new material compositions for products? And of course, I talk with procurement. So one of the first things is sourcing needs to get better connected with design. Because if you can't source these new materials at a per unit cost, it's going to be problematic. And then there's also that of course drives to, well, then who am I sourcing it from? And that gets to the question about doing so in an effective and efficient way that's also sustainable. So there's a lot of emphasis now on, when we talk about supply chain resiliency, how far do you have to go to actually get the materials that are necessary for your products? So transportation within the supply chain, being able to minimize local sourcing, being able, and that's the focus on circularity, recapture where you are instead of having to necessarily traverse the globe for it. So there's a focus on connecting internally, supply chain, talking more with purchasers, your procurement function, your sourcing function, those speaking with designers, understanding the impacts that design is having as far as what you're sourcing, and therefore the supply chain being set up to meet that. But then additionally, really starting to look at, when you're looking at your supply chain, bringing that resiliency in, diversifying the supplier base, but trying to, as you pointed out, develop processes to already take things back at phases during your manufacture and assembly processes, and also starting to look at, ultimately, it's going to be an emphasis on reverse logistics. Circularity is all about taking it back. And so what are you setting up? How are you helping your organization think through, if increasingly you're going to be responsible for taking back either in total or in part the products you're putting on the market, how is that possible, right? And that's, I think, one of the major challenges to circularity is reverse logistics and actually creating a solution for that company by company.
Great. And I think responsibility is something that you have touched upon as well. And I have one final question for you. And, it's touching upon your expertise in 3 different sectors, in nonprofits, corporations, and the government organizations. I would like to know, what are the roles of the 3 and how can they work together to best, hold different corporations responsible and themselves responsible for making these changes?
Oh, that's a good one, and a hard one to end this conversation on, because it could really go on for a long time. But you touch upon it. Industry can't be held responsible in and of itself to become circular without the support of both nonprofits who bring some of the technical expertise, who are committed to helping the change for the value of the change, and not necessarily for financial remuneration. And then, of course, there's the question of policymakers, and the policymakers are the enabling environment. I mean, part of what our goal is through the Global Electronics Council is to create a demand signal at scale through purchasers, right? So that helping industry understand that if you build it, you don't have to hope they will come, that they're actually there as buyers. And then as we started this conversation, so what does a circular product or service look like? Helping define that, to where purchasers can ask for it in a transparent way, an understandable way, an industry that knows what it means. And I think for in the tech sector, when we start thinking about what does it mean, it's really having the products and services be able to come back into a material flow. So it's the OEM having worked to design products and having set up the reverse logistics to take those products back to where we're really cutting the old paradigm of linearity and going back to a world in which our materials are brought back in and reused by somebody else. And so I think that's it. And again, to your point, really astute, it can't just be the companies who do it. They need the nonprofits who can help them understand the definitions and some of the ways to do it. And they need governments as enablers to create the policies to support them. And in particular, our role is to help stimulate governments to make circular procurements a reality at national, city, state levels, as well as, of course, the private sector by circular products and services as well. So it all works together and has to for it to to take place.
Definitely. It goes without being said that we all have a role, depending on what sector we come from, to work towards a circular economy. Like you said, it's called the Global Electronics Council. It takes people from around the world coming from everywhere. And I want to thank you for your continuous effort to work towards this, currently in the tech sector and sustainable procurement. But overall, you've touched upon and you've worked in all different sectors, so you've really made an impact so far, and it's great to see you continuing to work towards that. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for that. And it's always a pleasure to speak with those who also are interested. These are incredibly challenging topics to tackle. I hope that some of my comments that have been at the higher level, though, have sparked some thought and some interest. And of course, the Global Electronics Council is always available as a mission-driven nonprofit to provide free assistance and support to any organization interested, especially those in the tech sector, to moving towards greater sustainability and then taking that next step towards circularity. We're always available to help.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, walking away from talking to you, I think the main takeaway I have is the saying, take it back. And I think that's something that you've tied through this entire conversation is, reverse logistics and taking it back and, helping organizations, helping corporations get to the place where they can take it back. And so I think leaving it there and taking it back is something that's really important. And, let's continue to work together and move towards a circular economy. So thank you again. And it's been an absolute pleasure and a great conversation today.
Same here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.